Hello from the Harvard University Graduate School of Design. It is a pleasure to welcome all of you to the virtual public lecture that we are hosting today by Dr. Rebecca Choi. Before we begin, I just want to take a few moments to describe myself and my setting, as well as offer some quick reminders about some of the features you're going to be seeing throughout this webinar. So for our audiences who may have low vision, here's a brief description of myself and my surroundings. My name, as I said, is Erica Naginski. I teach architectural history here at the GSD, and currently I'm at home because of COVID, like so many of us. I'm seated at a desk with framed prints on the wall behind me. I'm a white woman with short brown hair and glasses and wearing a burgundy sweater. So first, a quick reminder about some of the features that you will see in this webinar. Rebecca will respond to questions from the audience after she has finished her lecture. So feel free to submit any questions into the queue at any time by using the Q&A button, which should be located at the bottom of your Zoom window. We also have live captioning available for this event. You can click the closed caption button at the bottom of your window to turn them on. I also, before we get started, want to invite you to join us for some upcoming GSD public programs. On Monday, April 12th at 12 p.m., please join us for a public lecture by architecture studio H Architectus, who will discuss how their practice makes natural phenomena evident and allows the invisible to appear. And on Tuesday, April 20th at 7:30 p.m., we will be welcoming architect Cecilia Puga to give a presentation on the history of her wonderful practice and current work. All of these lectures happen on Zoom. They require registration. More information about these events, as well as how to register for them, is available at the GSD's website. And one last but important thing to say before we turn to Rebecca's lecture, I would also like to acknowledge that I am calling in from the occupied land of the Massachusetts and Pawtucket Nations. I am an uninvited guest on this land and want to recognize those who have stewarded it, past and present. We are all in this audience calling in from different lands, and I would encourage you to take a moment to acknowledge whose land you are on before our program starts. You can use the links provided in the chat to learn more about land acknowledgements and to learn whose land you occupy if you do not already know. And now for today's event. It is really my very great pleasure to introduce to all of you Dr. Rebecca Choi. Dr. Choi, who completed her PhD at UCLA after having earned there the MA in Urban Planning and Design Development, is currently a postdoctoral fellow and visiting lecturer at the Institute for the History and Theory of Architecture at the ETH Zurich. Her research considers how movements for racial justice have had and continue to have a pivotal role in the making of urban America. She is currently working on a book that expands on her doctoral work, which is entitled Black Architectures, Race, Pedagogy, and Practice, 1957 to 1968. This work was developed through oral histories and alter institutional archives, and Black Architectures is nothing less than an atlas of resistance that pushes for greater intersectionality between architecture, critical race theory, and environmental studies. In addition to this wonderful book project, she has contributed essays to Harvard Design Magazine, the Avery Review, Ard Itiash Journal, and Places Journal. Her lecture today is entitled White Man's Got a God Complex. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rebecca Choi.
Thanks so much, Erica, for that generous introduction. I also want to just take a moment to extend a special thanks to Kat, Paige, and Matt for handling the logistics of this event, and of course to the Graduate School of Design for inviting me. I'll also give you a sort of description of my surroundings for those of you with low vision in our audience. I'm seated at a desk with a window behind me with the light shades down. There's a lamp on the table with a white lampshade. I am an Asian woman with long black hair wearing ceramic earrings. So today I'm speaking to you in my position as visiting lecturer at the ETH Zurich. At the moment, however, I'm in my mother's house in Los Angeles, in the traditional homeland of the Gabrielino Tongva people, the original caretakers of the Los Angeles basin. While we are not in a physical space together, I'd like to acknowledge that the locations where many of us are today do share a history of dispossession of indigenous peoples. So with that, I'd like to share my screen. It has been 60 years since the Harlem Uprising in 1964. Though these uprisings are not often cited as one of the determining factors that went on to shape the urban form of New York City, today, I will argue that the resistance of Black and Brown communities in Harlem expressed toward urban renewal projects had a direct impact on the financialization of city space. The analysis I present today show that it was through a constellation of three identifiable New York entities, Harlem, MoMA, and the mayor's office. I'll offer close readings of two objects, a report called The Threatened City, written by a group of internationally recognized architects, and one housing proposal called Housing Without Relocation, that shows how architects not only responded to racial uprisings, protests, and community activism in Harlem, but also built space for themselves within city and regional governments. Taken by Marian Trikosko on July 21st, 1964, around the time of the so-called riot in Harlem, this photo captures 75 demonstrators gathered on 67th Street to protest the killing of James Powell, a 15-year-old Black boy who was shot and killed by an off-duty white police officer. The words "Stop Killer Cops" draws us into the street. Multiple signs appear to hover above the crowd, if not for the hands that disclose that the signs are being held as a mouthpiece for the protester behind it. The photo has an intensely divided quality to it, both in content and in composition. A brick wall fills the upper half of the picture plane with bodies in the foreground creating a horizon line. The view is also divided. The photographer offers a view from behind the body of two policemen who create a gap just wide enough to frame the protesters that stand facing the camera on the other side. Trikosko, famous for his photos of the 1963 March on Washington, is not working with the aerial views for which he is known. Instead, he takes us into the streets of Harlem to provide a sectional view of grassroots activism, what Charles Payne describes as a global-oriented movement bred from the community organizing and community mobilizing tradition of what he calls, quote, the activism of an earlier socially invisible generation that began in Harlem before the Great Depression. Led by Chris Sproul, chairman of the Downtown Division of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, demonstrators marched chanting "Freedom now! Police brutality must go!" And by noon, representatives of the Progressive Labor Party and the Organization of Afro-American Unity were all present. The image invites us to attune ourselves to the spatial practice of what Robin Kelley calls Black freedom dreams. The mobilizing campaigns demanding community rights, civil rights, community control, and self-determination. And here I just want to point out that civil rights groups such as CORE and Black nationalist groups like PLP and AAU, even though they each endorse very different approaches to arriving at their demands, they were all present here or there. What is most interesting here is the visibility of the demonstrators as a whole. In the 1960s, Harlem was a touch point in community activism against anti-Black racism, police violence, municipal disinvestment, and the displacements rendered through a franchise of urban renewal. Through mediatized coverage of uprisings, American audiences became accustomed to the term, quote, race riot, emblazoned over photographs of policemen, their dogs, and protesters. Through that term, a syntactical assemblage of race and protest were brashly entered into the popular American lexicon. Rather than asking how renewal itself contributed to a cycle of entrenched poverty, those who were most invested, and I mean invested financially, in redeveloping urban districts reframed the term riot as a good reason to continue urban renewal projects. Using the Moynihan Report as the benchmark of a governmental racist sociology, discriminatory law and order measures increased policing in Black and brown neighborhoods at the same time that they pathologized and criminalized individuals within them. Outside the white mainstream, Black national political activists prefer to use the term crusades and revolts instead of riots, making clear associations with Marx and Engels' conceptualization of proletarian revolts as the necessary vehicle of social change and class struggle. Not only the different use of the term riots and crusades distinguish the ideologies behind the projects of renewal and Black nationalism, but they also contributed distinct discussions of what it meant to rebuild. Both ideas use language around building and architecture as a possible tool for meeting different ends. As one activist claimed, the crusade will bring liberation of Black men and women from tyranny, brutal repression, and yoke of white racism. They, the rioters, our brothers, have shown us the way. We must now plan, not destroy, to build and own our communities. In New York, the problem of the 6 days of violence that occurred in 1964 placed law and order at the forefront of civil politics. For dissenters, the uprising was a small revolution, an organized liberatory attack on white supremacy. In the immediate aftermath of the Harlem Uprising, New York's majority-minority neighborhoods, Brooklyn's Bed-Stuy, Queens, the Bronx, Staten Island, and Harlem, experienced a form of managerial governmentality that embraced surveillance and renewal, even while grassroots organizing in those neighborhoods proliferated. At the same time, uprisings like those in Harlem forced architects who were instrumental in urban renewal projects to create new roles for themselves outside of the realm of urban renewal projects. Typically, when architectural history addresses the historical milieu of social movements, they lump together protests related to the civil rights movement, Black Power activism, student protests against the war in Vietnam, protests against urban renewal projects, school sit-ins and shutdowns, and experiments in counterculture as a sort of naturalized narrative of routine riots that punctuated the 1960s. Indeed, these movements of resistance are characterized so routinely that the emphasis on the event of the riot obscured the ways in which the ever-changing forms of anti-Blackness and systems like architecture mutated to keep racial hierarchies in place. To address this historical moment of racial unrest, when architects are also forging new identities for themselves, I want to ask the following questions. In the time since the Harlem Uprising, how has architecture responded to anti-Blackness as it is legible in the streets here in the US and abroad? Why is it so difficult for architecture as a discipline and a profession to address racism? And why does architectural history treat uprisings as an amorphous and disembodied event? To write an architectural history of resistance, then, demands a greater specificity that accounts for freedom struggle, and thus opens doors for productive critiques that make it possible for current architects and activists to notice, engage, and intervene in our time. In her 1990 essay, The Romance of Resistance, Leila Abu Lughod recalibrated the relations between power and studies of resistance by inverting Foucault's assertion, where there is power, there is resistance, to read, where there is resistance, there is power. In the article, she demonstrated how studying resistance can be much more than looking at the examples of modes of resistance themselves, whether carried out at the scale of large-scale social movements or as non-organized moments of pushback, challenging us to study as a means to study resistance, as a means to examine power and the complexity of, quote, the nature and the forms of domination, unquote. Today, I want to take up Abu Lughod's challenge to study modes of resistance as a means to examine power. One of my main objects of study for this particular research is a series of oral histories provided to me by UCLA, which includes the transcripts of interviews that took place in 1996. However, due to copyright conditions, for the purposes of today's talk, I'll refer to those interviewed simply as the architect. Conversely, this anonymity furthers my goal in this presentation that rather than showcase those in power by naming them, my purpose here today is to show how those in power were impacted by forms of resistance and responded to that resistance. Consider this quote from the architect in his description of Chinatown. Well, you know, that's a very sensitive block that you've chosen, and there's a lot of community resistance there. And generally, the kinds of permits that you are going to want are going to take quite a long time, particularly with community resistance. What the architect is explaining to the interviewer is that when he's working with a company, he cites community resistance as a major obstacle in acquiring building permits in areas like Chinatown, and therefore encourages the companies to develop their properties in the architect's recommended part of the city. Clearly, the speaker is aware of community resistance and the stalling effect it would have. In my readings of oral histories, I noticed several other moments where the speaker acknowledges how minority voices from Chinatown to Coney Island to Harlem were gaining visibility and traction. The possibility for architects to reinvent themselves in the face of resistance presented itself early in 1965 when the mayoral candidate John Lindsay, whose campaign was called Design of the City, asked a group of architects to gather information on the hot button topic of segregated public housing in a project recently approved to be built in a middle-class Italian neighborhood in Coney Island. When attending a community meeting in Coney Island, these architects took notes on what they found to be loud and cataclysmic. Quote, "We were sent out to Coney Island because there was a big controversy about putting housing for Blacks in an Italian neighborhood or in a mixed middle-class neighborhood. All the candidates were invited to give their opinions. So we were sent out there as an advance team because, after all, we were architects and designers. And we attended several cataclysmic community meetings in which chairs were thrown, police were called in, and so on. And this was not what we thought architecture was about at Harvard and Yale and the University of Pennsylvania, but it was pretty damn exciting." They thought of their role and their presence there not as an opportunity to educate participants, to listen, or to serve as advocates, but to gather information on the important players and voices in community groups and gain insight on the street corners and places deemed most important by neighborhood residents. According to the oral histories, it was this intel they gave to Lindsay. He, in his speeches, played up his care toward those particular groups and places, got the vote, and then was able to do his projects. By revisiting these oral histories, which include the quote that I just shared with you, we learn two things. For one, it appears that architects were aware of community constituents at the time that they were rethinking their own role in urban spaces. And two, these accounts demonstrate a newfound awareness among politicians like Lindsay and the architects themselves of how much architects can contribute to local governance, and therefore how prominent the architect will suddenly become in New York government. This awareness marks a key transformation when the architect is no longer a designer, but a bureaucrat able to synthesize controversial development projects toward certain political gains. A number of architects recognize their value in political environments. They position themselves along businessmen, lawyers, and philanthropists as part of the mayor's task force to compose a report called The Threatened City, a report on the design of the city of New York, a small, square, 60-page booklet published in 1967. In this report, the task force warned of a, quote, ominous pall of smoke, unquote, that frequently obscures our skyline and burns our throats, among a range of other threats, including pollution of air, water, noise, and the visual state of the city. Citing architecture critic Alan Temko, the task force cast New York City as a space spinning towards Mumfordian doom, overgrown, overcongested, ill-managed, and ill-kempt, usually sullen, sometimes violent, and scarred by enormous gray areas. To the visitors from the West, there's a troubling sense of fatigue, a malignant weariness. The report, which alternated between presenting threats and solutions, spread across 4 chapters titled The Trouble, Opportunities, Toward a Method, and Proposals. By 1973, most of the solutions presented in the report had been adopted. At the end of the document, they included an organizational chart that you see here. The organizational chart is not recognizable as a typical drawing in the architect's toolkit, such as the plan, section, elevation, or even the bird's eye perspective, often rendered in a manner that visualized and pointed to future building schemes. However, the organizational chart begins to dislodge the very definition of what constituted an architectural drawing. Among many things, the chart visually made it possible to quickly see the streamlined process for any new building developments within the city. What is of interest here, circled, is the formation of a new group called the Council on Urban Design that the task force placed at the top of the decision-making chain. The council was placed in the same line of oversight as the mayor. On the left-hand side of the chart is a different body of architects who would be called the Urban Design Force. This force would exist as its own bureaucratic entity alongside the Department of City Planning. The report described the Urban Design Force role as making area designs for residential, commercial, and industrial districts, and to serve as a liaison between principal investors, operating agencies, and private developers. The location of the Urban Design Force and the council on the chart is telling. Whether positioned as end nodes or functioning at the bottleneck of design decisions, the Urban Design Force was given unparalleled oversight of decision-making jurisdiction. In this schematic, the force would hold the same discretionary power as the mayor, the planning commissioner, the planning director, and it would oversee entire entities of transportation, recreation, housing and development, and public works. Derived from a genealogy of modeling information rather than visualizing future proposals, the chart reveals a level of architecture's entanglement and influence on governmentality. No longer was the architect's role simply to implement policy. Now they could mediate it. It was in the Threatened City report that the idea of a new designation for the architect within civil service, the urban designer, would take shape. In this diagram, also included at the end of the report, the architects visualized the complex pinball machine-like procedure for capital development projects. Rather than requiring that all policy set to be legalized be sent back up to the mayor to be approved, as the pinball diagram suggests, this new streamlined pipeline gave the urban designer full discretionary power to standardize and produce policy, which, as we'll see, will be crucial for the implementation of a new type of transfer of air rights. And from this new position, They could invent new ideas like banking of air that I'll be discussed in a moment. Here, urban designers became an entity with an incredible degree of power. And installing these urban designers was not neutral. In fact, the city and the council created a stipulation that only credentialed urban designers could be hired. I see the term credentialed as a coded term for fixing the hiring process. As one architect states in the oral histories, the council architects devised exams that, quote, took these people which could take and fail, and which people we wanted to hire could take and pass. Indeed, in 1975, after Mayor Lindsay had left, a young Paul Goldberger wrote in the Times saying that there was one architect on staff in city planning in 1967. Now there are 48, with 30 more in affiliated agencies. The architects are on the payroll as urban designers, a new profession that sees its job as providing guidance at the point where politics and architecture meet. It was a favorite interest of former Mayor John Lindsay, and urban designers their work gained headlines in Lindsay's years for creating pedestrian malls, innovative zoning districts, proposals for multi-use buildings, all of which gave the city a national reputation for leadership in the field. Goldberg's stats show how many more urban designers were positioned to enter the city workforce. And other important figures like Arthur Drexler, museum director of MoMA, picked up on that shift. It was through these urban design councils that Drexler envisioned a new type of exhibit for MoMA. If the city planned to take areas they deemed quote unquote threatened and national emergencies, such as Harlem, South Bronx, and Brooklyn, as test sites for new design-focused urban renewal plans, why not use the museum as a further site to exhibit those ideas? Picking up on currents already swirling in uptown circles, Drexler also wanted to be involved in architecture's new method of approaching urban renewal. Before the new city, Drexler believed that architecture with a capital A was not involved in renewal schemes. The museum director wrote to the mayor's office in 1966. He said, "We believe that the urgency of urban renewal problems in the United States is now so great that we must be admitted to the area of the museum's interest in modern architecture." Invoking both alarmism and opportunism, the letter set into motion plans for an exhibition funded in large part by the mayor's office, branded as an exhibition that was, quote, intended to help the public visualize some changes that architectural planning can offer to improve the life in New York City, unquote. The new city architecture and urban renewal opened at MoMA in January 1967. And like the 13th Century Report, Drexler's vision for the new city described the city in the throes of crisis, reflecting on the need to target what he called, quote, problem areas of New York's so-called ghettos. Drexler chose to show case studies of Upper Manhattan, Harlem to be exact, as the ideal site for designs cleaned up alternatives because it offered for him, quote, the greatest possible number of problems to solve using architecture. 4 university teams were invited to think through what a future Harlem could look like. And here's a legend of the schools and which area of Upper Manhattan they investigated. Of the 4 proposals, the Columbia team's proposal in red, titled Housing Without Relocation, presents itself as a full institutional address of architecture's intersection with discussions about racial uprisings as a perceived threat and the role of urban design as a possible salve to the violence in the streets. Given how many of the members of the Columbia team were individuals working with the mayor's office at the time, the project reflects discussions that were being had by the mayor's office and his advisors. The Columbia team were the same architects envisioned by the Threatened City Report. They were the ones working for the mayor, going out to Coney Island, gathering intel, making comments about Chinatown. And so for the remainder of this talk, I will refer to this group of architects as the council architects. And based on the oral histories I shared earlier, the council architects understood how mobilizing voices were resisting racist legal arrangements associated with land ownership in New York City, such tools as blockbusting, redlining, policing, charging, and sentencing, each of which operated at the scale of a geographic plane. During the mid-1960s, in Harlem, Columbia University's efforts to quote-unquote reform the area were met by local community organizations protesting against racist development patterns. Those in power searched for a new policy, a strategy that would help developers tighten their hold on an area that was already laden with discriminatory practices. What the council architects do, and what the Housing Without Relocation project demonstrates, is how air rights, and new development practices of banking air could be a creative tool, and I would argue a predatory instrument for the next iteration of urban renewal, a way to financialize and speculate on property while circumventing on-the-ground resistance. Housing Without Relocation is a pertinent place to recognize how air moved across borders in ways that other things didn't. At the time, the council architects understood full well that air was a commodity subject to the least amount of regulation, and therefore the most desirable thing to control. The idea that council architects could call the project Housing Without Relocation, when in fact the team proposed to demolish close to 74 blocks of Harlem, as it is written in the exhibition catalog, stands in stark contrast to the project's purported claims. In plan, the logic of the project presents itself as one that supports north-south flow of movement along Park Avenue. Park Avenue was a long north-south boulevard running parallel to Central Park. As the diagram on the left suggests, the existing rail line shown in the plan extended past the Harlem River and down 97th Street, beyond Housing Without Relocation's purported site boundaries. Electrical bus lines in blue were intended to run alongside the outer sides of their housing scheme at an intermediate level where access would be made available from the streets below and the pedestrian boulevard above, not at the ground level. Describing this scheme as, quote, providing fast and pleasant local transportation, unquote, the council architects presented an allegory of city life enriched by circulation, a rational plan that, when viewed in section, was not dissimilar to Robert Moses's infamous Lower Manhattan Expressway. It was a template for how to modernize the city through infrastructural development. Viewed in section, the project is a large heap of urban objects, stairs, bridges, tunnels, doors, and successive blocks of apartments. Built in 1837, the New York and Harlem Railway that ran along Park Avenue was a relatively porous structure of wrought iron girders and steel beams that allowed plenty of movement for cars and people on the ground plane to walk beneath and move through the tracks. When viewed from above, however, Housing Without Relocation appears to be a linear wall-like project made up of urban essentials from electrical bus line and housing, yes, but closed off in the form of a shell. Had it been built, it would have separated the white neighborhood to the east from the predominantly Black neighborhood that makes up central Harlem, with only 6 clear openings for east-west movement along its length. Housing Without Relocation, with its barrel vault, train-like tunnel, would have essentially bisected 2 miles of Harlem, cutting off one side from the other. Given this observation, the project would have transformed what was an infrastructural zone of porosity into a continuous linear tunnel using the technology of dam building. Nicknamed the Vault, Housing Without Relocation was essentially a long tunnel-like structure upon which housing blocks could be built. At its northernmost section, the vault cut through East and Central Harlem. In theory, the vault would conceal both the noise and what they called visual blight of the trains that ran along the elevated tracks of Park Avenue. And Housing Without Relocation appeared to solve 2 problems at once. Indeed, it appeared to conceal the unsightly infrastructure and to build housing on top of it. According to the council architects, the project focused on an area of Harlem that architects perceived to be wounded. As written in the exhibition catalog, the project's use of, this is what the council architects say in the catalog, quote, the use of air rights over the tracks would convert this major source of blight into a new building, well ventilated and brightly lighted, unquote. The vault was imagined as a concrete shell on which housing from townhouses to high-rises could be constructed, as if building on the side of a hill. And using the same engineering innovations developed for the construction of dams, the long line was a deliberate product of a construction technique that relied on a machine that could continuously pour concrete over a fixed linear track. Rolling on wheels, the machine would leave behind that tunnel structure that you see. The existing tracks, the area's quote-unquote greatest single source of blight, would be successfully hidden from sight. With this intervention, what was previously considered an area of derelict or blight could be remade with new buildings. And so while this project may have appeared as a discrete object, the vault itself relied on the surrounding neighborhood, the air above to be precise, to provide the support for its underlying form. In this diagram that I've sort of created here, the 3- and 6-story housing complexes labeled 2 take advantage of the air rights bought and transferred from the blocks that flank the tracks labeled 1. In other words, the relationship between the air that surrounds the built form was key to Housing Without Relocation's success. The council architect's portrayal of air is illustrated in the section drawing as a vast empty white space, suggesting how the team of architects abstracted their project as one comprised of buildings rather than a project that gained its form by virtue of its access to, yet ultimate exploitation of, the air above the tracks. In the exhibition catalog, the council architects explained that the cost of acquiring the air rights and adjacent property, plus the cost of constructing the vault, is competitive with the total sum that would have to be expended to condemn and clear a comparable land elsewhere in Harlem, unquote. So for me, this is the moment air rights, and new development practices of banking air is visualized as a creative tool that could feasibly circumvent on the ground resistance. And to be clear, the reception of the show was mixed. And some of the reviews add to the complexity of the exhibition's moment. Some visitors to the show wrote letters of appreciation, such as Ralph Ellison and his wife, Fanny McConnell, as well as poet June Jordan. The show, also had plenty of critics too, such as Harlem-based Architects Renewal Committee and Reyner Banham. But part of the reason that it received fanfare, at least I think, is in part for the fact that the housing relocation scheme shows banking air in a way that gets planted and visualized as an idea where the development actually happens in the space where the air is taken. But air was never used this way. When we actually look at the ways in which banking air plays out after the show, the first example being in 1973, where the very same council architects negotiated the moving of air from and between entire districts, in the case of Seaport. A consortium of 5 banks, led by Chase Manhattan Bank, began to buy up and stockpile the air over the South Street Seaport District in Manhattan. The idea of banking air, as the name suggests, anticipated that air rights could be bought but used at a later time, similar to the practices of speculating on similar to the practices of speculating on financial packages carried out by the New York Stock Exchange. In the case of the Seaport, the bank bought out the interests of a private developer, thus regulating any fluctuation in price based on demand that might occur. To make this near monopoly of air rights legal, the council architects emphasized its promise as a historic preservation effort. The promise or the process of institutionalizing banking air was not easy, but as members of local governance, the council architects were perfectly poised to navigate some of the bureaucratic maneuvers required to make banking air possible. Among the monopoly buyouts, the strategies used to help ensure stability included things like higher density quotas around subway sites. Also, the council architects developed sophisticated regulatory tools such as discretionary zoning laws, special zoning districts such as preservation zones, even such moves as relaxing environmental laws and lowering corporate taxes helped ensure that the market value of air would remain the same, if not govern the price of it completely. All of these negotiations and laying down of legal frameworks were where the groundwork for a speculative real estate market could be had, were imagined, developed, invented by council architects under the premise that banking air could serve as an incredibly powerful urban design tool to shape the city by steering the ways in which and where development could occur. The effects of, for example, the banking of air rights over seaport were touted as a successful public good for citizens, rather than the fact that it was an enormous financial win for the private banks and developers. For example, the remaining seaport air rights were recently bought by the Howard Hughes Corporation from Chase Bank in 2014, with plans to redevelop the area with a purported $751 million project. In Through Vegetal Being, Lucy Irigaray and Michelle Marder wrote on the uniqueness of air, providing us with an invisible dwelling wherever we are or go. Air is also a faithful companion for those who can pay attention to its invisible presence, unquote. Their use of the word pay helps us consider, in the context of housing without relocation, the cost of the natural resource. The uniqueness of air for the council architects was precisely because of its invisibility. A little pocket to put money in that was invisible and actually comes out, chutes and ladders in a different part of the city. Banking air manipulated how and where funds were channeled, and this newfound liquidity, where capital became so fluid that it fundamentally changed the way urban form was shaped, was, and now most relevant for this talk, birthed willfully as a response to and in the context of racial tension in the street. The council architects envisioned a housing scheme that boosted living spaces into the air above Harlem. But in their claim to rethink Harlem through seemingly typical modernist design interventions, the council concealed its effort to recode the problem of the city through its recalibration of air rights that ultimately paved the way for policy solutions that only further entrenched the status quo. That is, entrenching the discriminatory policymaking strategies woven into the texture of the built environment of New York City. Of course, a God complex is a belief in one's personal ability, privilege, and infallibility, and it is often associated with a sense of omnipotence, omnipresence, all-seeing, all-knowing. In the final verse of the last poet's song, White Man's Got a God Complex, they call on that sensibility. Damn, can't you see the place is falling down? No, you can't dig it because you ain't ever around. Damn, I'm so poor, I don't know what the hell I'm gonna do anymore. Not from this day to the next, because the white man's got a God complex. The last poets who met at the Harlem Writers Workshop at 125th Street and Lenox Avenue at the north end of the vault ask an imaginary landlord, can't you see the place is falling down? No, you can't. You ain't even around. Yet they were around. The invisible landlords and anonymous architects of Harlem in this talk had a self-made invisibility, a carefully managed God complex that extended to the management of air above and around buildings. In today's talk, I hope to have demonstrated that the concept of banking air was not just a tool for market development, but a racially motivated form of governmentality born as a response to and avoidance of mobilizing minority voices visible in the streets of New York. Coalitional imaginaries and community organizing served as an entry point for us to trace ever-mutating forms of power. In its many iterations, whether in the way that architects worked in city governments to promote seemingly race-neutral design schemes, to promote legislation on air rights by the mayor's office, or the museum's opportunistic readiness to engage in civic affairs, each shaped the tangible and intangible substance of air into an artifice with real consequences. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. That was a brilliant talk, stunningly researched. And before I turn to some of the questions from the audience, I'd actually love to hear a little bit more about how you ultimately came to frame this research. One of the things that strikes me, of course, is that you're taking almost a kind of dyadic or dialectical approach. On the one hand, you delved into, and I think this is what a kind of new generation is doing so forcefully, you delved into oral history and into some of the methods that come from anthropology, actually. And the sort of idea that certain records bear witness in a way that others don't. On the other side of it, is a sort of incredibly diligent analysis, and I would say heavily diagrammatic analysis of bureaucracy and its organization, whether that's through the government structure, committees, the university, the museum, or capitalism itself. And I know that often it's difficult actually to find the ways in which those interstices happen and resistance then can be located when we have these two very different sort of ways of understanding highly complex situations involving urban planning in the city. And so I just wanted to hear more about your encounter ultimately with the notion of oral history and how this has transformed your research methods. I mean, I think in this talk, you probably ultimately went more towards institutional history in the end. It seemed weighed that way, but I'm sure that's not the case in the broader book. And I would love to hear more about that, just to sort of get us started.
Yeah, thank you for that question and those observations. Absolutely. Part of the effort that I was trying to do with this book project that is really an extension of my doctoral research is to question the archive. And so oral histories, conducting interviews myself, going into architects' garages, and just talking to people was a kind of very much anthropological, ethnographic kind of methodology that wasn't sort of readily used in architectural history, and try to understand how I can move against the archives, institutional archives. And so indeed, as you observed, while this project is heavily pulling from the institutional archives, the broader sort of trajectory of the project itself doesn't merely look at institutional correspondences or archival work. I went and interviewed Black architects and architects in training who were the ones that were resisting these kind of urban renewal plans, hearing their perspectives, what they imagined and what they produced. And you know, while this talk really wanted to sort of drive home the point of, you know, what can we learn from resistance movements and how is power changing in other parts of the project, I really take care and time to look at the project of resistance itself. What did it look like? How did it speak? It didn't operate in the sort of typical way of architecture responding through building. it responded through manifestos. It responded through demanding changes in the curriculums that architects and minority architects were forced to take in sort of really Ivy League schools at the time. So that
Right.
really framed my thinking.
Lovely. I have other questions, but I see already that we have a question, and I'd like to just read it out to you. I think this is this is coming from Vector Projects Kenya, and offering, I think, a really apt quote from Colin Rowe. So I'm going to read it out and then just read the question at the end. Colin Rowe wrote that, quote, "The demand that all buildings should become works of architecture is offensive to common sense. Like literature, architecture is a discriminatory concept which can enjoy a lively exchange with its vernacular, literally, quote, home-born slave," end of quote. But with the exigencies of the single central vision, palpitating with a sense of its own goodness, will not allow any determination so obvious as the architect became both Messiah and scientist, end of quote. And here's the question: weren't the 1960s the high watermark of that white messianic virtue?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Vector Projects. Hello. Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely it was. And I think sometimes, especially when the architect himself speaks and sort of takes a position of what they were and weren't doing, it conceals a lot of it conceals a lot. In other words, I think in responding to your question, I'll revert to like my own research, which is in the oral histories. If the Colin Rowe quote if I were to encounter that, I would sort of approach it in the same way that I approached the quotes that I pulled and shared with you in the oral histories, which is, what is it that the architects are saying that seem to give us information, but actually tell us much more of the context of that moment? And so I think a lot of the times in the 1960s, so many of the architects that are identifiable today take on the hat of like, oh, well, that was happening in the streets, and we were involved in architecture with a capital A, or claiming to retreat. This is the moment when the architects are claiming to retreat into interiority or creating a kind of autonomous architecture or paper architecture, whilst sort of, at least from my perspective, knowing that there are certain violences that are taking place in their backyard or in the back door. And so I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but yeah, I mean, I think when I hear things like, well, wasn't it this time? Yeah, it was that time, but can we today look back in these moments and try to sort of pinpoint a more sort of specific understanding of a particular positionality, and try to circulate and triangulate around that positionality that really demonstrates that even things and statements and projects that appear to us as neutral, race neutral, we can find sort of threads of whiteness embedded in them.
Lovely. I'm going to read another, I think this is more of a comment. In fact, David Lieberman, who submitted this, calls it a provocation to comment, not so much a question. So let me read this out loud. Housing without relocation, rather than simply delineating a boundary or limit to the exclusivity of territorial imperatives, established a thickened space of separation, not unlike the Green Line of Cyprus, the DMZ of the Koreas, the now dissolved border between East-West Germany. In the guise of providing amenity through the efficacy of transportation and quote unquote open space, it establishes and reinforces a spatiality of difference, never to be occupied, and institutionalizing social and economic containment and the confinement of communities. The apparent intelligence of banking air, rather providing a potential unity, establishing the parameters of rampant avarice and greed and self-aggrandizement, leading to the current state of neoliberal late capitalism, a mask of responsibility to a highly suspect agenda, which does not lead to broader based community and enriched culture, a future of promise. A provocation to comment, not really a question. Thank you for your thorough research and articulate delivery.
Thank you so much for that really nice summary. It's always nice to hear your work being sort of summarized back to you and to know that the ideas have stuck.
So food for thought, and I'm going to read out a question from Warren Haggist. Are air rights still used to avoid community opposition, or has the discourse/use around them evolved? For example, the New York City Housing Authority has recently started selling air rights to fill funding gaps in federal or state government funding. How does this relate to to your history, to that history?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah, absolutely. Air rights are still being used in New York and across the US. And I suppose in the same manner that the talk is provoking us to consistently be alert and vigilant to ever forms of mutating, the ever-changing forms of power. Air rights and the way that it's sort of dispossessing sort of communities of color are happening, but it's happening in a twofold manner. A lot of the times, and this just recently happened in 2018, and the artist Tamaya Jackson has done a really sort of amazing art piece on precisely the neighborhood that is in question. But essentially what happens is a neighborhood that is deemed historic, like under historic preservation, is that building's air rights are sold, and those air rights are sold, and those air rights are used to build in another part of the city. The dispossession happens when certain neighborhoods that or buildings that don't necessarily fit within the kind of typical frameworks of what would be considered like a historical landmark or historical building. And I'm not against preservation at all, don't get me wrong. I mean, there are very important buildings that need to be preserved, but a lot of developers have come in and tried to deem buildings as historically relevant, push existing minority families who live there out, and then redevelop the area. So again, like it's a kind of twofold act that happens with dispossession.
And in some ways, that's a segue directly into the next comment, and then I'll go on to a question, which is from Vector Projects Kenya. We could argue that the messianic science of social cleansing the city is more sophisticated and venal now than then. This is a question from a colleague of ours, Ana Maria Leon. Hi, Rebecca. I was thinking of air rights and the importance of the void and its overlap with the interest in solid void play and the work of many architects in the other teams in that exhibit. And yes, thank you for bringing that up, Anna Maria. I was about to ask about that as well. So you're asking it for me. I'm thinking of the involvement of the White's 5 arches. I was wondering if the void as politically charged tool of displacement can be used to confront the Whites' depoliticized play of solid voids. The Whites, after all, being all about their whiteness. Sorry for my clunky reading there. The type is a little bit small.
Could you repeat? Hey, ML, thanks for joining. Um, could you repeat the void part? The void. The
I was wondering, I was wondering if the void, as politically charged tool of displacement, can be used to confront the whites' depoliticized play of solid voids. The whites, after all, being all about their whiteness.
Wow, such a good question. I don't know. I don't know how to respond to it. But the fact that you're bringing up this sort of solid void does make me sort of think about how we can approach the question of void, uh, uh, emptiness, nothingness, being, blackness, like those kinds of terms as a kind of dialectical sort of response to the kinds of projects that the whites are putting forward. Um, I don't know if like Anna Maria could be unmuted, but
Can I do that? Maybe I'll ask Paige to see if she could do that and read another question while we see if she can. This is a question from Michelle Wilkinson. Hi, Michelle. Thank you. Can you share a bit more about the positive comments made by June Jordan and Ralph Ellison you mentioned? It's interesting to think about the points of agreement and discord amongst Black Americans.
yeah, thanks for that question. And the when I when I saw the letters in the archives, I was so surprised. And I think part of the reason why it was so interesting for me to see the letters is because this isn't a simple story, right? Like white architects bad, mobilizing community voices good, but really a kind of story about the sort of those in power and those disenfranchised and dispossessed. June Jordan, Ellison, like on the one hand, they're modernists, right? So when they see a kind of modernist project in MoMA, like it's almost understandable that the reception would be positive. I think also, you know, I'll and then I'll have two other comments that I want to say. One is, if I read the positive reception by Jordan and Ellison, Ellison's wife writes to Drexler's assistant and she says like, oh, thanks for coming into the community and thinking about, what could be had. Jordan, on the other hand, this is the exact moment that she puts forward her Skyrise for Harlem plan with Buckminster Fuller. And it's exactly the moment, well, actually, she publishes her project in 65 in Esquire magazine before even the new city is conceived. And for her, she's already thought about these kind of like utopian schemes for Harlem. And so when she sees, one might argue that her scheme with Buckminster Fuller is sort of non-attainable, a bit outlandish, or sort of quote unquote utopian, not actually buildable. Fuller would, say otherwise. But so, as she's thinking about her own sort of architectural plans for Harlem, she sees that a cultural institution with the scale and notoriety of MoMA is putting on a show that takes the exact same space that she's interested in, and puts forward these very modernist and to a degree also outlandish project proposals. And so that's kind of like the background. And I suppose I would answer your question with, that one is that, I think Ellison is a modernist, and these are modernist proposals, and they are visually stunning. And then I think perhaps the second way I would answer is my own sort of experience working in Los Angeles when I go into sort of minority neighborhoods and seeing the sheer amount of support from neighborhood residents to see potential investment in their neighborhood. And I think that with Ellison and Jordan, part of that sort of excitement is exactly that. There seems to be interest in Harlem, and the museum is putting forward some potential schemes.
In a way, that's a perfect segue to the next question from C. Evers. Hi, Rebecca. Thank you for your research and incisive talk. Given the ideascape and wider social net opened by a post-Trumpian liberal state of politics, reconstruction, reparations, what is your vision for the interface of design praxis with the multiple constituency stakeholders in this new opportunistic space?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you know, in this era, you know, we can look to so many figures like Ronaldo Wilcott and Ananya Roy, who are putting forward a clear kind of pathway forward to push against regimes of white supremacy, whiteness as property, this neoliberal sort of capital state, as you rightly described it, Evers. And for them, you know, the philosophy is abolition, right? In every sort of capacity of that term, against sort of against the police state, against private property, against sexism, heteropatriarchy, you know, all of these sort of modalities and systems that have been designed, and as I've sort of tried to demonstrate here, are constantly shifting so as to be able to maintain its hold, need to be abolished.
And Anna Maria just chimed in again. I'm so glad to be able to get her voice back in the conversation. Sorry for my confused phrasing, Rebecca. I guess I was just thinking with your great analysis of the Columbia section and wondering whether the whites' interest in manipulating the void is set up as depoliticized and autonomous while it was being done by contemporaneous architects with specific intentions, as you've demonstrated. Your reading informs a new reading of the whites. Sorry, this has now become a comment, not a question, she says. Although it's a great comment with many sort of ways to follow up.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Sorry, is there more?
No, go ahead.
Okay, no, because I was going to say thanks for that clarification, because yes, absolutely, like the void is put forward as sort of depoliticized, but we know that not to be true, and that and we can sort of politicize it in a variety of directions that might be fruitful for us.
And maybe this is going back a little bit to her initial question. Do you see that at work in some of the other projects in the exhibit?
Yeah, I mean,
in the same way. How do you weigh those against the Columbia or the Council Architects?
I mean, all of them. So, you know, I'm pausing because we're in a recorded setting, but all of the proposals are incredibly navel gazing and not sort of engaging or sort of engaging the place that is Harlem, even though they're going into that space. The other like Princeton with Eisenman, Stanford Anderson, and MIT, Cornell and Colin Rowe actually is the green land section. They all put form as the kind of driving poche of their project, the principal pensée, but and so much of the language that they use also, I mean, Colin Rowe too, he says, like, I'm not interested in like the social advocacy of architects. I'm putting up, this form. Um, and Eisenman and his Princeton team choose the waterfront near Morningside Heights, like obviously the space that is the most expensive real estate in that portion of the exhibition site plan, and creates these very sort of geometric volumes, whilst at the same time in a sort of kind of, I don't want to say private setting, but simultaneously trying to exploit urban renewal funds, as Lucia LA's Real and Theoretical beautifully outlines for us, right? That he's, aware of the Harlem Youth Organization, trying to be opportunistic and get those renewal funds and start doing, so
Right.
they're equally implicated in this narrative. I would say I just chose the Columbia team just because the sheer amount of overlap with the city.
Thank you. Let me read another question from Precious Dukuba. Thank you so much for the amazing talk. My question is, where can we break the chain? At what point in the education of architects can we change what we do now to raise a generation of architects without this God complex? Can your research be applied to educational structures to try to dismantle the issues you raise in your research?
Yeah, thanks for that question. That's a really hard question, that is, an ongoing question that is constantly on my mind, and a question that we all ask each other amongst, colleagues and friends in the architecture field. And perhaps, I don't know, I'm like reluctant to say like, undoing pedagogy, but I think really like what's at stake is property. Once we can untether property as this sort of like driving force, not only in sort of white racial formations and fantasies of what, urban space should look like, but the sheer amount of sort of money and capital that gets flowed through property today. And if we can sort of abolish that, then perhaps we can start to rethink how architectural education might be reconfigured.
Yeah, and I mean, it's such a crucial question, pedagogy. And it actually, one of the things that occurs to me as I read that question, we have the word architects here, but you actually didn't utter the word urban planner very much. And it's interesting to see the rise of the urban designer, right? And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that, I think probably deliberate choice. And I'm curious because, what one also would think that would have a lot to do with this story.
Yeah, thanks for that observation. And absolutely,
Sorry,
I mean,
I don't have to. I don't have to. You don't have to answer that right
no,
now. But
I
I
mean,
just wanted to.
it's totally true. And I'll give a sort of amended quick answer, which is, I don't see the urban planner as necessarily outside of the frame of the architect that I've described. But for the purposes of the narrative, the architects, and in particular the council architects, didn't see themselves as planners. The planners in this moment are doing the advocacy, the participatory planning, the community design workshops. Like planners have their own history of the sort of top-down expert, but in the moment of the 60s, yeah, they're reinventing themselves too. And so there's so And then so for me, what I found so fascinating in looking at the archives was that this term urban designer, right? It's like this new term. At least, you know, I mean, I have to say that in Boston with Ed Logue, like, you know, he implements the urban designer years before Lindsay does. But
Yeah.
nonetheless, you know, the urban, and to not totally nerd out, but like, you know, this is also the moment when urban design schools are being cultivated in architecture schools. UPenn is doing the civic design program. The GSD had implemented
Yep.
they
The Indeed, absolutely. And here at the GSD, actually, it's a Department of Urban Design and Planning, which is interesting too. And it has a complex history vis-a-vis the Kennedy School and more sort of policy-driven attitudes. Let me read another question for you from Apurva Rao. Hi, Rebecca. Thank you for such a wonderful lecture. I currently work for a firm that is designing charter schools in the Bronx along the newly rezoned or being rezoned Jerome Avenue. This area is being developed into high rises with charter schools being used as the social collateral to appeal to the Bronx Community Board. I wonder what you think about social collateral in the transfer of air rights in New York's newly rezoned districts. It seems to have circumvented the issue of displacing minority communities.
Yeah, I mean, such a good question. What an interesting project. Thanks for that question. You know, like I feel that social collateral, those kinds of like sound bites smack so much of this like constant shifting of neoliberalism's hand in trying to hold power. You know, like social collateral, um, uh, cultural preservation, um, you know, zones that supposedly support that, like empowerment zones and opportunity zones, all just sort of technologies and strategies for developers to continue building in the way that they want. I'm not familiar with the Bronx charter school project that you're describing, so I can't speak specifically to it. But you know, I don't want to always have the critical standpoint, but I suppose you know, maybe we can always slow down, and maybe you, as the sort of architect designer involved in the project, can slow down and ask the architects or the firm involved to also sort of see all sort of sides of the project rather than just feeding into the pipeline of like, okay, this is going to be a social collateral for the neighborhood. Let's go through it all the way. And I think there are other projects that do this and can do it well. The trouble is that it takes time, it takes effort, it takes actual time to talk to people, and it takes money.
I'm going to read another question from Damon Rich. Thanks for the paper, and curious to hear any thoughts on the ways in which the New City exhibition connects consolidating quote unquote urban design establishment connected to Lindsay and the Rowe Eisenman cohort that go on to shape elite academic architectural ideology for the next 2 decades. Are these two groups of white men mainly in alignment across these spheres of activity, or are there telling divergences?
Thank you for that question. I think that I'm going to answer it through a methodological response, which is I think that the New City, the NY5, the Whites, all of the architects involved, MoMA itself, Drexler, you know, these names we know so well, and they continue to be investigated. And that's fine. But architectural history has this tendency to consistently look and canonize certain individuals whilst excluding others. So do I think that it's part of this kind of next 2 years, decades? I think that it can be if we write that kind of history. I think that if we look at it as a moment to say, like, no, actually, there are a lot more interesting projects that are being had by architects that or designers that aren't credentialed, that may not be sort of classified or categorizable in the traditional or typical ways that we have sort of upheld architecture as a discipline and profession thus far. Then I think we can sort of classify the new city as just kind of a blip. Like, what if we just didn't even consider it as like this big, exhibition with a lot of then important architects, right? And elevate some other responses to it, not as a counter, but as a history.
It's a lovely answer. I think we're getting near to the end of our time. And David Lieberman sent in a lovely comment for all of us who are gathered in this room to listen to your marvelous talk. So I'm just going to read it as a way to bid goodbye to our audience. Will any of us ever meet, quote unquote, to paraphrase Gabriel Garcia Marquez in a combinatory text, over a year of solitude, life and love in the time of the virus? Thank you so much, Rebecca. That was absolutely wonderful. What a brilliant talk. Thank
Thanks
you
so
again.
much.